All right, so we are on to our next session, public records requests. Public records request. Let's see. Our presenter for this session is Stephanie Gertken, who is a records and data management specialist with the Wyoming State Archives. She holds a Master of Science in Information and with a specialization in Archives and Records Management from the University of Michigan School of Information, and has over 6 years of records management experience with the state of Wyoming. Stephanie relishes the opportunity to help local governments and state agencies identify and achieve their records management goals. And those of you just joining me now, I just wanted to let you know that this session is being recorded. If you do want to participate and ask questions, feel free to do so in the chat box. You can also send me a direct message, and there will be time at the very end to unmute yourself and ask questions. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Stephanie.
Hello again, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. I apologize for my voice. I'm getting over a cold here, so I'll be taking some little tea pauses. Let's see here. So I am going to be providing a brief overview of public records requests, including public records acts, and practical recommendations. I am not a lawyer. I'm providing general guidance about public records requests based on my experience as a records manager. So I just recommend everyone to contact your organization's legal representation with questions about how to interpret any applicable laws or rules and what your organization's responsibilities are when you're fulfilling a public records request. Okay. So public records acts. Generally, public records acts are going to be either federal or state. They include what's covered under the act, any exemptions to the act, the responsibilities of government entities, the process for a request and any appeals, and parameters for whether an agency can charge the requester fees for staff time or copies. And generally, their purpose is to allow the public to access government records unless they're exempt. They also are there to promote disclosure and government transparency. So, a brief introduction of the federal act, the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. It applies to federal agency records. And according to the FOIA website, the basic function is to ensure informed citizens, which are vital to the functioning of a democratic society. FOIA has 9 categories of exemptions. They protect interests such as personal privacy, privileged communication, national security, law enforcement. And the Office of Information Policy at the Department of Justice provides government-wide guidance on FOIA overall. So state records acts, they're going to vary greatly depending on the individual state legislation and those requirements. As far as Wyoming goes, we are covered under the Public Records Act, which details regulations such as how a public record is defined, deadlines for when you need to respond to a request, whether there are any grounds for denying a request, and then parameters for fees. And the Wyoming Public Records Act applies to government entities, which basically is the state of Wyoming, any state agencies or institutions, as well as local governments, school districts, special districts. So basically any level of government in Wyoming is covered under Wyoming's Public Records Act. I'm going to plug a couple of times here. The Wyoming Legislative Service Office put together a great presentation that provides more information about Wyoming's Public Records Act. So please check that out if you want more information about that. Wyoming's Public Records Act also provides for a records ombudsman who helps to resolve concerns and mediate disputes about records requests. And they also assist agencies in understanding their public records request obligations. Some other resources on their site are a complaint form. If a member of the public is concerned about how a public records request was handled, they can submit a complaint to the Public Records Ombudsman. They also have a list of public records contacts. So for local governments and state agencies, they can submit the person who should be the contact for that agency. And then there's also a flow chart that kind of walks you through how does a request work? What are the steps? So it's some good information there. Now, public records requests in terms of practical recommendations. I'm going to talk more broadly about considerations and how to use good record keeping practices throughout the life cycle of a record in order to facilitate public records requests. Like I say, the Wyoming Legislative Service Office put together a very straightforward presentation on the Wyoming Public Records Act, which features frequently asked questions as well as a step-by-step guide when you receive a request. So please do take a look at that if you want some more specific information. The first step as far as practical recommendations is knowing the scope. What are your organization's responsibilities when it comes to a public records request? And part of that is knowing, a big part of that is knowing what are the applicable regulations. Do you have federal records? Do you have state records? Are those covered under those records acts? Are there any other laws that might apply to your records, including privacy, consumer protection laws, education, privacy laws? And now the next level of that is, does your organization have any rules or internal policies that dictate the release of information? And as an example for the state of Wyoming, Wyoming's Department of Administration and Information passed a rule that dictated how state agencies can charge fees. So the Wyoming Public Records Act says, here are the parameters that agencies can charge fees. And then A&I said, here is what you will charge when it comes to staff time. So it's important to know both layers of those regulations. It's also important to know what information is exempt from release. And if you have records that are exempt, are you required to redact it, or can the entire record be withheld? And that's going to vary depending on your regulations and requirements. Once again, contact your organization's legal representation with any questions. The other side of knowing the scope is knowing your records. And if you were able to join us earlier, we talk a little bit about this in general record keeping practices. You want to know what records you have and where they are. File plans can really help with this because it breaks down, we've got these records on a shared drive, and these records are in the digital archives. These records are in a file cabinet. But when you get a public records request, any record that is responsive to your request is your responsibility to identify and determine what you need to do with. So you have to know what your records are and where they are. It's also important to know how long you need to keep your records. And I thought it was important to note that if there are records responsive to an open public records request, they cannot be destroyed, even if they've met their retention. If the request is open, that puts a hold on that record, and you have to hold on to it until the request is closed. Another aspect of this is that you need to know the scope of the request. And that presentation I talked about with the Wyoming Legislative Service Office talks about this as really the first step when you get a request. Read the request. What are they asking for? Make sure that you understand what they're asking for so that you can provide the best information possible. And if you need to, reach out to the requester and get clarification. If it's vague or if they might not be providing all the information you need to fulfill the request, get clarification from the requester so that you can provide them the best information you can. So in addition to knowing the scope, we want to keep doing those regular records management practices. One of the best ways that we can facilitate public records request is by practicing good records management throughout the life cycle. When we identify and describe and capture in a records management system, we can find those records more easily. We also need to store the records securely to ensure their integrity. And we apply those retention schedules to properly dispose of records when they reach the end of their life cycle. So finally, and this is really part of the life cycle, but it's important enough to call out here, document. I noted document authorized destruction, and there was a great comment earlier today about documenting the destruction that happens accidentally too. So yes, document any destruction due to a natural disaster. Document the destruction of records that have met their retention period. Document the destruction of any original paper records that were digitized and stored securely. And it's critical to keep these records keep the destruction records for as long as someone might have questions. And generally that's forever. Because whether you're talking about a record that you have to keep for 1 year or 100, someone may have questions about this in the future, and you want to be able to show that you did exactly the right thing for these records. So in summary, public records requests are crucial. They ensure government accountability, transparency, and informed citizens. And we all play a vital role in this process by knowing the scope, by providing timely and regular record keeping, and by documenting destruction. So I know that was very brief. Does anyone have any questions for me? For example, is proved. Oh my goodness, half shredded. Nobody wants that. So Karen's question is, if you are in the middle of destroying a record and a records request comes in for it, what happens? For example, it was approved to shred and you have half of it shredded. Well, it's certainly not an ideal situation. My understanding of it is that once the request comes in, that is what sort of shuts things down, right? So I would say as soon as you become aware of it, you have to stop. And you know, I would certainly document the situation to the best of your ability and write down what you know and when you knew it, so that you can say, we had authorized destruction on this, and then we received this request. So we don't have this portion, but we are providing the portion we have. And Sarah, I don't know if you have anything else to add as far as that question goes.
You know, that's exactly the same thought process. And thank you, Karen, for such a great question. Does anybody else have any other questions for us right now? Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box at this time. Stephanie's contact information is listed here on this slide. Stephanie will be joining us for this session, the next session, and all sessions on Thursday. And you can always contact her directly. If you find that you have come up with a question later and you don't remember how to contact Stephanie, you can always contact me as well, and we'll be happy to help